हेलो स्टूडेंट्स, वेलकम टू माय चैनल ओमनी ज्ञान। मेरे चैनल ओमनी ज्ञान में आप सब लोगों को फिर से बहुत बहुत स्वागत है। So today we will be learning the poem "And So It Eventually Happened," composed by R. Parthasarathy, and this is in the class 12 English syllabus. Okay, a very short poem, not a very long poem. It will be very easy for you to understand. The language is very simple. Okay, the poet has used a very simple language in the poem. So let us first have a little bit of introduction to the poem. Okay, this poem is an excerpt from the third part of the poem Rough Passage by R. Parthasarathy. So this poem is actually, there are three parts of the poem actually, and the big poem is actually a Rough Passage. Okay, and this poem Rough Passage consists of three parts. Okay, first part, second part, and third part. And this poem "And So It Eventually Happened," this is actually the third part of this big poem. Okay, and another very interesting thing about this poem Rough Passage is that it took 15 years, 15 साल लगे पोएट को ये पोम खत्म कर रहे हैं. ओके, लिखने में it took 15 years for the poet to complete this poem. Okay, so you see that such a lot of hard work and struggle behind the poem. Okay, and this third part of this poem, now we'll talk of the poem "And So It Eventually Happened." This poem actually is about the poet's reunion with his extended family. Okay, extended family means a big family. Okay, we call it joint family in simple words. Okay, तो पोएट का जो जॉइंट फैमिली है, पोएट उसके बारे में लिख रहे हैं कि पोएट बहुत सालों बाद, ओके, आफ्टर अ लॉन्ग लॉन्ग टाइम, द पोएट्स फैमिली, ओके, हिज फैमिली इज गोइंग टू हैव अ रीयूनियन. ठीक है. Now, why the word eventually? And so it eventually happened. Okay. Now, this eventually word may be interpreted into different meanings. बहुत सारे meanings इसका निकाला जा सकता है. Eventually के एक meaning जो है वो है कि after a long delay or a gap. Okay. So the word eventually in the title here implies after a long delay or gap. Even you may say that eventually means so finally this reunion is happening in the family after a long gap. Okay. So it could mean both. That finally, eventually would also mean finally the poet is going to have a reunion, and eventually could also mean that after a long delay or after a long gap, the poet is going to, the poet's family is going to have a reunion. So both the terms are equally similar. Okay, you can use both the terms in your notes. Okay, now let us learn the poem. Okay, now look at the language. Language used in the poem is very simple. Language जो है poem में बहुत simple है. ठीक है, तो हम लोग पहले देख लेते हैं पहला दो stanza, stanza 1 and stanza 2. And so it eventually happened, a family reunion not heard of, since grandfather died in 59. 59 is 1959 in March. This year, cousins arrived in Tiruchenur in overcrowded private buses, the dust of unlettered years. So this is the first stanza, and this is the second stanza. Okay, and we will be learning both the stanzas now. Okay, the explanation of both the stanzas now here. So finally, you see, after a long gap. So as I said that if it is asked that write down or justify the title of the poem, okay, or comment on the title of the poem, or why is the title "And So It Eventually Happened." If these kinds of questions will be asked, you can go on writing. Actually, title means whenever a question on title is asked, okay, it is nothing but a summary itself. Okay, आप जो है उस summary को ही present करेंगे. poem का जो summary है उसको ही आप present करेंगे, explaining the meaning of the title. Okay, so title in one way is a summary. So finally, after a long gap, a family reunion is going to happen in the poet's family. So and so it eventually happened. ठीक है, एक बहुत long gap के बाद poet जो है, poet का जो पूरा family है वो एक reunion, ठीक है, दोबारा meet करने वाले हैं. Okay. Next point is this reunion has not happened since their grandfather died in March 1959, that very year. इसका मतलब ये कि last they met in the year 1959. That was the last meeting. Okay. In other words, it could mean that last the family met in 1959. After that, they did not meet because in the year 1959 their grandfather died. So that was the last time that the poet and his family had a reunion. जब पोएट का जो ग्रैंडफादर है, मतलब उस फैमिली का जो ग्रैंडफादर है, जब उनका डेथ हुआ था मार्च 1959 में, वो उनका लास्ट मीटिंग था. दैट वाज देयर लास्ट मीटिंग. बट आफ्टर दैट, ओके, after 1959 the poet had not met, you know, his family members. Okay, so all are scattered here and there in various places, you know. All their family members are working, all his family members are actually working here and there. So finally this reunion is happening in their family and in the hometown of the poet. Okay, this kind of reunion is quite unheard of and is a very special one. So you see here, look at this line here, that a family reunion not heard of since grandfather died in 1959. That means, you know, all these years since 1959 they did not have any communication with one another. They did not write letters to one another, and obviously if it is 1959 there were no mobile phones at that time, no WhatsApp, no Facebooks at that time, right? So that communication could be established. So after 1959 none of them met, and now after long gap they are meeting. So this reunion is going to be a very special one. Okay, now second stanza, you see, cousins had arrived in Tiruchenur, traveling in overcrowded private buses through the dusty roads. All right, so it's a village scene, actually it's a rural scene, it's a village scene. The setting of the poem is actually a rural setting, a village setting. Okay, so cousins had arrived in Tiruchenur, traveling in overcrowded private buses through the dusty roads. Okay, so सारे cousins जो है, all the cousins who had been scattered here and there due to their, you know, work schedules, all these cousins are actually coming now to Tiruchenur. Okay, and they are traveling in private buses and the roads are very dusty. It is very easy and simple to understand. Second point, here you see, this is the second stanza. Okay, all these years not a single letter was written by any family members to one another. So at that time letter was the only means of communication. Telegram was also used to be sent at that time, but letters were used widely. So not a single letter was written to any of the family members by one another. So in other words, we can say that none of them had any communication with one another. None of them had any contacts with one another. किसी के साथ किसी का कोई contact नहीं था उस family में. ठीक है? Now let us see stanza 3 and 4. Clouding instant recognition, later each one pulled, sitting cross-legged on the steps of the Choltree, familiar coconuts out of the fire of rice and pickle afternoons. Now let us look at the explanation here. Okay, this is the third stanza and this is the fourth stanza. Now, explanation. They could not recognize one another as a lot of physical changes had taken place. Obviously, most of them have grown up. Alright, so when they first met, after a long time when they were meeting, they could not recognize one another because they're, you know, the physical changes in their faces, the physical changes in their bodies. So because of that, you see, nobody could recognize one another. Okay, and as I told you that 1959 was you know, the period when people did not have WhatsApp, Facebook, so they don't remember their faces also. Okay, so it seemed to be quite blurry. Okay, their this recognition factor seemed to be quite blurry. कि हल्का हल्का सा याद था एक दूसरे का चेहरा क्योंकि बहुत सारा चेंजेस आ चुका था physically, and because they were meeting after a long time, so when they met instantly they could not recognize one another. It is not that they could not recognize one another completely, but instantly they could not recognize one another. Okay, like who is the eldest cousin, who is the youngest cousin, you know, these kind of confusions were there inside their mind. Okay, then you see, then in the afternoon, so here we come to later each one pulled, sitting cross-legged on the steps. So here you see, then in the afternoon each one of them sat cross-legged on the steps of the Choltree. Choltree is nothing but a village hall. Okay, in the village hall. Okay, village hall or a place in the village where people have gathering. Okay, so in the afternoon, see, when the poet reached his home and all the cousins had arrived there in the home, what happened is that in the afternoon time, each one of them, they sat, they started talking to one another, and cross-legged here means that they were now sitting very relaxed. Okay, they were sitting very relaxed on the steps. सीढ़ियों पे बैठे हुए थे. कहाँ कहाँ पे बैठे हुए थे? Where were they sitting on the steps? The steps were actually in that chol tree. Okay, in the village hall. Okay, so they were sitting in the on the steps of the village hall or village community hall, and they were chatting with one another because they were meeting after a long time. So they were, chatting. They have a lot of things to share, lot of talks, lot of things to share with one another, what they were doing all these years. So many kind of gossips are there. Okay, so they were sitting very relaxed, in a very relaxed position. They were sitting on the steps of the village hall, and they were talking to one another in the afternoon. Then the fourth stanza, you see, this village hall is a place for gathering. So as I told you, that village hall or village community hall is a place for gathering. So all of them were sitting there very relaxed. Okay, so fourth stanza, as I said, they had rice and pickle for lunch. And this rice and pickle for lunch is a familiar meal actually that they used to have earlier. So all the nostalgic elements, all the nostalgic feelings, started gathering inside their minds. So you see, in 1959 when they last met, जब 1959 में उनका last meet हुआ था, तब उन्होंने खाया था rice and pickle. Okay, it is a kind of a traditional, customary traditional lunch actually. Okay, and they were having the same thing again after a long time. Okay, so rice and pickle for lunch, and it's a very familiar meal that they used to have earlier. तो वो लोग पहले rice and pickle ऐसे खाया करते थे, तो फिर से जो है वही rice और pickle फिर से बना lunch के लिए. Okay, then stanza 5 and 6, and this is the last stanza actually. So Sundari, who had squirreled up and down forbidden tamarind trees in her long skirt every morning with me. Me here is the poet. So me यहाँ पे कौन है? Me is the poet here. Okay, our Parthasarathy stood there. This is the sixth and the last stanza. Stood there that day, 40 years taller, her 3 daughters floating like safe planets near her. Let us learn the explanation. So in the 5th stanza, the poet speaks of a girl Sundari. ठीक है, तो 5th stanza में poet किसके बारे में बात कर रही है? The poet is talking about a girl whose name is Sundari. The poet and Sundari had played together when they were children. When the poet and Sundari, this girl, when they were children, actually they used to play together. Okay, when they were children. So all these memories started coming inside the mind of the poet actually. Okay, and they used to run and play a lot. They also climbed up and down the tamarind trees. इमली का जो पेड़ होता है वहाँ पे जो है सुंदरी और पोएट दोनों बचपन में खेला करते थे. They used to play when they were children. They used to run and play a lot. They used to climb up and down the tamarind trees. Okay, so all these are memories actually that flashed in the mind of the poet when the poet suddenly saw Sundari standing in front of her in the village hall. ठीक है, तो वो पुराना जो मेमोरी है वो पोएट को याद आने लगा. ठीक है, now you see, now Sundari, when Sundari was a small girl and the poet also was a small boy, so Sundari would wear a long skirt and play every morning with the poet. तो हर सुबह जो है, every morning Sundari would play with the poet when Sundari and the poet, when they were children, and Sundari would be wearing long skirt. Okay, so all these memories came back to the poet as he saw Sundari now. So all these memories, you see, look at the scene. Okay, I'll just describe the scene once more for all of you so that you can visualize, so that you can imagine. Okay, just imagine a picture in your mind. The poet is sitting with his cousins, with his family members in the village hall. They are talking and chatting, gossiping. In the afternoon time, they had rice and pickle for lunch. And suddenly, you see, Sundari comes. And Sundari is now a grown-up woman actually. Alright. But when the poet saw Sundari, all the memories, all those childhood memories flashed in the mind of the poet. And the poet started thinking that when Sundari and the poet, they were children, they used to play, they used to climb the tamarind trees. Sundari used to wear long skirt, and every morning Sundari would play with the poet. हर सुबह सुंदरी जो है पोएट के साथ खेला करती थी और इमली के पेड़ों पे चरा करते थे दोनों. फिर दोनों कितने खेलते थे. तो ये सब मेमोरी जो है पोएट के माइंड में ये सब मेमोरी आने लगा और जब पोएट ने सुंदरी को अपने सामने देखा. बट now Sundari has changed. How? Sundari was no more a no more a child. Sundari अब वो छोटी बच्ची नहीं थी. Poet was also an adult. Sundari was also an adult. Sundari was now a woman of 40 years. So Sundari का भी उम्र क्या है? 40 years. Sundari is now a 40-year-old woman. Obviously, we can say that the poet was also 40 then. Okay, तो poet का उम्र भी अब 40 ही होगा. अगर दोनों बच्चे थे as kids when they used to play, if their age were quite similar when they were children. Okay, now obviously if Sundari is 40, that means the poet is also 40 years old. So Sundari was now a woman of 40 years old, and now you see she had 3 daughters, and those 3 daughters were actually Sundari had brought her 3 daughters with her to the village home at present. Okay, so her 3 daughters, now those 3 daughters were with her like safe planets. Now let us look at the analysis of the poem. So you see the poem ends. Okay, the poem ends, and the theme of the poem is like nostalgia is one of the elements, one of the themes of the poem. Okay, so let us have a very short analysis. In this poem, the poet expresses his strong love for his family. Obviously, if the poet is talking about reunion, that means the poet actually has a great emotion, feeling attached to his family. Okay, so the poet expresses his strong love for his family. Lots of old memories keep visiting his mind. Obviously, lots of old memories start visiting his mind. Now, we also know that they gather in a village hall, and obviously all the family members share the same nostalgic feeling. वो जो एक nostalgic feeling है कि पुराने दिनों में old times, during childhood times, we used to play with one another, cousins of the poet. Okay, all of them as family members, they used to play with one another. They kept on sharing all those old memories. Okay, and how much they missed one another when they were not in touch, when they were not communicating, when they were not in contact with one another. They missed one another so much. This could have been the discussion, the topic of discussions, okay, among the poet's family members, right? And you see, as they were meeting after a long time, they were not able to recognize one another instantly. तो after a long gap, after a long time, जब poet अपने cousin से मिले, तो instantly जो है, momently, एक दूसरे को पहचान नहीं पाए. They could not recognize one another instantly. Okay, because their facial expressions have changed, their physical structures have changed, their faces have changed. They were all now grown up, है ना? That is why they could not recognize one another instantly. Okay, instantly. Then they had a hearty meal according to their culture and tradition. Okay, rice and pickle is their culture and part of their culture and tradition. Okay, this kind of meal. Okay, and then finally the poet talks of his childhood friend. Who is the childhood friend? Sundari. She is now a 40-year-old woman having 3 daughters. The past memories of childhood makes the poet nostalgic once again. Hannah, the poet, when he sees Sundari standing in front of her, she is no more a child now. She is no more a small girl. She is now a 40-year-old woman. And look at the poet. The poet was, remembering all those childhood days when he and Sundari used to play, climb up and down the tamarind trees, have lots of fun together. Sundari used to wear, long skirts that kids used to wear. But now Sundari is no more that little girl. Sundari has grown up. And not only that, she is having 3 daughters and she is a 40-year-old woman now. Okay, so the past memories of childhood makes the poet nostalgic once again. Okay, so this is the poem, and so it eventually happened. In fact, third part of the big poem, Rough Passage. Okay, so this is a poem, a very short poem, very simple language, easy language, and I hope you have understood the poem very nicely. And if there is any confusion, if there is anything that you would like to ask, feel free to comment in the comment box. Okay, so that's all from me for today. Thank you so much for watching the video, and subscribe to the channel if you have not subscribed. Like and share my videos. I'm also on Facebook, I'm also on Instagram. You can follow me there also, and if there are any queries, you can ask me there also. Okay, so with love from Omni Gyan, and all the best to all of you. Thank you.